Did the Exodus really happen? Today I sit down with biblical archaeologist Douglas Petrovich to discuss this very important question.
Welcome to EIE Radio, encouraging, inspiring, and equipping Christians to stand for truth and reach the lost. Now, here's your host, Neil Hess.
All right, welcome to this week's edition of the EIE Radio broadcast. On the line I have soon-to-be Dr. Douglas Petrovich, and he is an archaeologist, and he is here to talk to us about the validity of the Exodus story. So, soon-to-be Dr. Petrovich, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Neil.
So, if you wouldn't mind starting off, I love hearing testimonies. I'd appreciate it if you just tell us your testimony of how you came to know Jesus.
Absolutely. Basically, the heart of the story goes back to my junior high days when, growing up, in a public school, I just came to the place where I began asking all of those, important questions in life, such as, does God really exist? And if he does exist, what does he expect of me? What's my responsibility? And as I asked all of those questions, one thing that was extremely important was watching the life of the junior high pastor, because I was in what nowadays we call a mega church growing up, and we had maybe 300 plus junior hires, and it seemed as though he commonly singled me out and would ask me questions about what's going on in my life and in my heart and those kinds of things. And just in seeing his life, he would spend his vacations going down to the East Coast to evangelize. I just thought, wow, here's the perfect example of a true Christian who loves people, loves God, and is completely giving himself over to how God can use him. And it was just perfect timing, because I was asking the kinds of questions that his life basically was answering for me. And God really used all of that to bring me to realize God does exist. I do have a responsibility to him, and therefore my life belongs to him if I become a Christian. And so I repented and believed, and amazingly saw changes take place in my life, even as a junior hire, just as a result of that.
All right, well, I appreciate that you're sharing that. Thank you. So what specifically motivated you to get into archaeology and Exodus archaeology specifically?
Well, interestingly enough, I used to have an aversion to Egyptology. I didn't even like it at all. I pretty much thought it was boring and, a strange field. And then when I was in my Master of Theology program at seminary, I took a course with one of my professors in Old Testament history, and he made us read a book by Hallow and Simpson called The Ancient Near East History. And this book was divided into basically two halves. One was on ancient Mesopotamia, and the other was on ancient Egypt. And I read this book, and to my amazement, I actually became fascinated with Egyptology. And I started to read more about it than what was even required. Then, not too many years later, in fact, very soon after, as it works, I moved to Siberia, Russia, and there I helped to open a seminary, and I was academic dean and did a lot of teaching myself. And one of the courses that I put into the curriculum, because I got to write the curriculum, was Old Testament history. And I taught that course as well. In fact, I put far more into this course than my professor had even demanded of me. And because the Russian students had so few good sources in the Russian language, I needed to make class notes for them. So I began typing notes out, and they were translated, and that turned into 170 pages, single-spaced, with 725 footnotes. So that shows you the vast amount of research that I had done. And every summer when I returned to the States from the field, I would go to the UCLA library, and I'd find and read more books that I had found out about in the footnotes of articles or books that I had been reading. So I also did a lot of reading of evangelical views of important things like the timing of the Exodus, the identity of the Exodus Pharaoh, and other topics. And I became convinced pretty much that the early Exodus view, as it's called, which dates the Exodus to the 15th century BC, is the only one that's supported by a literal reading of the Bible's chronological passages. And I, on my own, through my own research, had come up with support for this from the world of Egyptology, which basically was unknown to evangelical scholars because very few, if any, Christian scholars actually have studied Egyptology to any great length. So all of this kind of came together, and I soon came to have such a convincing case that I knew I had to go out and publish an article on all that I had found, and so I did that in 2006. And basically this article represents the most comprehensive study of the Exodus pharaoh that was ever undertaken, and it demonstrates that there's only one pharaoh of the 18th or 19th pharaonic dynasties who matches all of the biographical requirements of the Exodus pharaoh. So basically this is how I got my start into the whole area of the connection, the convergence between biblical history and ancient Egyptian history.
Okay, so now I want to read you a couple of quotes that I found, and I'd just like you to answer true or false, and if it's false, just kind of, I guess, back up your statements a little bit here. So the first one here is from, I believe, is Zev Herzog. He's professor of archaeology and ancient Near Eastern studies at Tel Aviv University, and this is what he says. This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel.
The answer to that is patently false. Problem number one is you have to be digging at the right place if you're talking about excavations demonstrating that the that the Israelites weren't in Egypt. And basically, what it comes down to is one argument that's often used in ancient Near Eastern studies, and it's a false friend, is the argument from silence. In other words, just because you don't know of something, just because you have no evidence for something, that is not positive evidence to disprove it. So basically, from a platform of ignorance, the claim is made by many secular archaeologists and ancient Near Eastern historians that the Israelites could not have been in Egypt, but that is purely presupposition and conviction, but not based on it's not based on positive evidence. It's based on the lack of, in their minds, any positive evidence.
Okay, and the second quote here is from Rabbi David Wolpe. Virtually every modern Virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all.
I would say that as he wrote that, it's absolutely true, but this near consensus pretty much proves nothing whatsoever. The scholarly consensus also used to be, years ago, that the Bible's Hittites were a figment of someone's imagination. Now there are experts, though, in a field known as Hittitology, and these experts are all across the globe. So the point is, things change. But what's more, I now have an article awaiting approval for publication, which demonstrates clearly, with physical evidence, that not only are the events of the Exodus archaeologically verifiable, but the first Passover itself is also archaeologically verifiable.
Wow, and that's huge.
This is huge. And this article represents the finding of biblical archaeology's holy grail, which is the Exodus itself. And I believe that God's going to use it to punch a gaping hole in the ship of the anti-biblical history campaign that's being navigated by many ancient Near Eastern historians and archaeologists.
Okay. And so what is archaeology? I mean, when we think of archaeology, I tend to think of Indiana Jones because, I grew up in the 80s. But, what is archaeology capable of telling us about Exodus, and what is it not able to tell us about Exodus, just as a discipline? Okay.
I'll start with the second half first. Archaeology cannot tell us anything about the supernatural events recorded in the Bible. So if you ever have visions of seeing answers, evidence to that's presented, most likely it's a safe bet to say you should just ignore it, because those events are historical events that in and of themselves cannot be proven with factual material. It's pretty much futile, I think, to try to find for example, the exact crossing point of really it's the Reed Sea, we call it the Red Sea, because the topography has changed drastically over the last 3,450 plus years, including the positions of the sea's inlets in respect to the shoreline. So basically, because there is a great change in where was land then, where was sea then, compared to now, where was land and where is land and where is sea. We don't have all of the same topographical conditions lined up, so we're never going to, with any certainty, find where that crossing point was. We can make guesses if we can believe that conditions would have been the same, but there's a lot of assumption there. Now, some ancient Near Eastern scholars who oppose biblical historicity have claimed that the plague of darkness and or the plague of hail can be connected to a certain volcanic eruption known as Thera, which is one of history's worst volcanic eruptions. But evidence now available reveals that the pumice, and pumice, of course, is the light rock that forms as rock when it flies out of a volcano and it hits water, and the cooling process opens up air pockets within it, and so that's a certain kind of rock that's the result of a volcanic eruption. And we have evidence that pumice from Thera's very eruption was used for polishing bronze weapons in the very workshops of one of the cities where the Israelites fled, in the Exodus. And this stratum, this archaeological level period of time, can be dated to the reign of Amenhotep II, who is the only possible candidate for the Egyptian pharaoh. So pumice was long in use at the time that this specific pumice from the Thera eruption was long in use in the hands of the Israelites at the time that the biblical plagues were taking place. So we can't support secular scholars' arguments when they say, well, we can explain away, we can rationalize the plague of hail or the plague of darkness because there would have been what looked like hail and what would have been darkness because of the cloud of the volcanic eruption. So all of this would have been experienced by the Israelites. Well, that's disproven by what we found based on all of the evidence that's going to come out in my article. Now, then I'll get to the second half of your question. As for what archaeology can tell us, let me just mention that at one certain site from where the Exodus took place, archaeologists found unusual animal burials that include all of the animals mentioned in Exodus 11 and 12: sheep, goats, dogs, and cattle. And we can actually count on one hand the number of dogs and cattle combined on one hand. But the number of burials of sheep and goats, some with multiple corpses in those burials, in other words, more than just one sheep or goat, several, not the animals themselves, but the burials themselves number over 30. Moreover, the age and condition at death of these sheep and goats perfectly fits the biblical narrative. And most importantly, the pottery that's associated with the burials, in other words, the pottery found in the very burials themselves, is dated exclusively to pottery that was made during the reigns of Thutmose III and his son Amenhotep II. The exciting part is that there is much more inscriptional and textual evidence that supports the strange and catastrophic events that must have taken place in Egypt during the year of the Exodus. And basically, this textual evidence works together with the archaeological evidence.
And what textual sources you're talking about textual sources, what textual sources have you found that supports the Exodus?
Well, that's a good question. And there are some very important textual sources, probably the two most important of which I'll mention now. First, an article came out in 2011 by a friend of mine who's a Dutch scholar who's now living in Germany named Peter van der Veen. And this article identifies the name Israel on a name ring, which essentially is a collection of names of peoples conquered by an Egyptian pharaoh. Well, until now, the oldest evidence of the name Israel is on the Merneptah stele, which dates to late in the 13th century BC. The Berlin pedestal, which is the object discussed by Peter, was dated to the 18th dynasty by him and his colleagues, 18th Egyptian dynasty. And Amenhotep II, by the way, is in the 18th dynasty. Well, they've been doing a lot more research on it since then, and now their epigrapher dates the Berlin pedestal to the very reign of Amenhotep II, and that's already in articles that are just coming out, and this is all based on orthography. So we have evidence that Amenhotep II probably captured Israelites during his reign, meaning Israelites in Asia, that is outside of Egypt, because the name rings refer to peoples that he went out of the bounds of Egypt and on a military campaign brought back slaves. Then the second inscriptional evidence is known as the Memphis stele of Amenhotep II, and it's long been known to list 3,600 Apiru people among those peoples that he captured on his Year 9 campaign. Well, it just so happens that his Year 9 overall matches perfectly with the timing of the Exodus. For years, the scholarly consensus was that the Apiru people were synonymous with the Hebrew people, although nowadays scholars kind of oppose this idea in large number because it suggests that the Hebrews were living in Asia, east of Egypt, during the centuries just before the Merneptah stele of the 13th century BC. However, eventually I'll be addressing these arguments and making a strong case for the proper nature of this association. In other words, I will be arguing that we should be connecting the Hebrews to the Apiru. So what these inscriptions combine to tell us is that the Israelites were captured in November of the year of the Exodus, meaning that there is a sizable contingent of Israelites who strayed from the main body of Israel, which would have taken place during a period that was silent in the biblical narrative, meaning a time when Moses was writing nothing about what was happening.
Huh. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, is about the path of the Exodus. Do you feel that we've likely found the path of the Exodus?
I think that with relative certainty we can recreate what most likely was that path. There are several options. Probably the two Christian scholars who are the most adept at identifying this path would be Dr. Bryant Wood and Dr. James Hoffmeyer. And Dr. Hoffmeyer believes in a late Exodus view, which I disagree with. Dr. Wood believes in an early Exodus view, which I agree with. And most likely, if you consult Bryant Wood's reconstruction, that would be the most faithful sketch that we can make of the Israelites' Exodus outside of Egypt to Sinai, and then eventually up into to the land of Moab.
Okay, and now I've seen online there's an infamous chariot wheel that was found at the bottom of the Red Sea, and I've heard claims both for and against it. And I'm just curious what you think about the chariot wheel.
Sure. Well, the bottom line is there's a lot of sensationalism about certain kinds of evidence for the Exodus, and I think most likely this chariot wheel falls right into that category. Probably the chariots that were consumed by the walls of fire but the walls of water that fell on the Egyptians over 3,450 years ago. Probably those chariots were long covered by sediment, and sediment that continued to increase, and so as time has progressed. So it's most likely that these chariot wheels, if they were indeed bronze, and there's a very good chance they were, if indeed they are still out there somewhere. Most likely they are very deeply buried somewhere, and the question is just, can anyone find that needle in a haystack? And it's, it could go either way. But I'm very leery of the idea of trying to identify a potential chariot wheel that's on the level, the sea level nowadays. The chances that it would be not covered by sediment by now, and a large amount of sediment, it's astronomical. So I would be very suspect, and the only way you're going to really know that for sure, as a possibility even, is to extract one of those wheels and do a metallurgical study on the bronze itself to see where the bronze came from, what can be known about that, and is it possible that the dating can be connected to the time of the Exodus.
And when you're talking about the depth of the sediment, are you talking a few inches, or are you talking like dozens of feet, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, most likely you're talking about several feet to even more than that would be the sedimentary level covering the original chariot wheels.
Okay. So we had an audience question from Carol about whether the Ten Commandments can be linked back to Egypt instead of God on Mount Sinai. Apparently she had heard some skeptics make that claim. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would start off by saying, first of all, that most skeptics would even say, well, the Israelite law, the Ten Commandments, it has a precursor, and we can pretty much look back to the law code of Hammurabi, and he was a king in the ancient Mesopotamia, one of the old Babylonian kings, and he had a very well-established law code, and it was in practice for the old Babylonian Empire, although that was a small one at the time, and it was an excellent way of regulating the problems going on in their culture and so forth. And I would say this is definitely one of the earlier law codes, but it's not even the earliest. We have law codes that go back even to the time of Ur-Nammu, from the third dynasty of Ur, basically at the beginning of the second millennium BC, so around 2000 BC is when the empire ended. So even back that far, we have in the ancient Near Eastern world, we have codified law codes that were implemented by rulers to regulate behavior within their societies. But the bottom line is, none of those and none of the laws that we see here and there in Egyptian records, none of them is exactly in any way, shape, or form even close to what we find in the biblical narrative. The way that punishment is meted out, doled out in some of these law codes, it's severe. It's very severe. And what you have oftentimes is a lack of parallelism between the crime and the punishment. In other words, one of the beauties of the Israelite law is that you have in every case the punishment fitting the crime. And that's why we read about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We hear that and we're intimidated by it, and we think that's pretty severe. But really, the bottom line is, as it was intended, what God was saying is, I will not allow more than an eye to be taken for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, if you steal my cattle, I can't grab you and prove that you're guilty and have you killed or stoned or whatever. So the point is that the punishment will fit the crime. And in the ancient Near Eastern law codes, we don't always have that going on. There's some bizarre forms of punishment, some severe forms of punishment, and very arbitrary ones, such as you will be cast into the river, tied up, and if you survive, then that will show that you were innocent, that kind of thing. So How that is equivalent with justice is beyond modern conception. That's not justice. That's just throwing randomness into the judicial process.
Okay, and so if a skeptic were to come up to one of our listeners and just ask them, or just state to them, the Exodus never happened, what's the one piece of evidence or the one argument or statement that you think would just instantly counter that?
Well, definitely it's all the evidence that I found, especially at this certain archaeological site, that now the article is in the hands of a publisher who's already submitted it to several peer reviewers, and hopefully that will come back with a favorable result. I'm trying to publish it in a secular journal, and that in itself would be an amazing thing. It would have to be, divine intervention for this to be published in a secular journal, because obviously it's going to solidify, to verify the biblical account. And not many secular scholars will be too excited about doing this nowadays. 30, 40 years ago, no problem, but nowadays it will be very difficult. So basically what I was referring to you before, I think is the most powerful evidence. We have evidence of sheep and goats that didn't just die natural deaths. One very clearly that died from a blow to the head by a blunt instrument. And considering the ages of these animals, it fits perfectly with what we read about at the Passover event itself. So when all of this becomes public, I think this will be a great shock to the ancient Near Eastern historical world.
Okay, and you mentioned this article, and it's just kind of got me salivating now, wanting to read it. And is there anything else that you would be able to tell us about at this time? I know for the time being you're probably supposed to keep kind of quiet about it, but I'm just curious what you would be able to tell us.
Let's see. What more can I tell you about the article on the Exodus that's coming out? Also, here's something very important. Most biblical scholars who deal with, and even commentators who know the book of Exodus very well, when they discuss the events that took place from the beginning of the book of Exodus down to the days of Moses himself and the Exodus itself, they really don't document well, or they don't really connect well with the what we read about in the text and the actual historical situation. In other words, they are attributing, for example, the Pharaoh who arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. They are assigning that oftentimes to the wrong Pharaoh and the wrong dynasty too. And as I've done an incredible amount of study since the late 1990s in this whole area, I became convinced a long time ago how the historical connections take place. And then in this year, and this was just in January of this year, 2012, when I just fell into all of this evidence for the Exodus, it completely confirmed what I've always believed. And basically, what the evidence is going to show from this site is that you have a picture-perfect connection between each and every one of those events that you read about. For example, it shows that in the biblical text that right around the time of Moses' birth, and that would be dating historically to the reign of Thutmose I, we should be, what did take place is we have a lot of terrible treatment of the Israelites by the Egyptians, by the taskmasters. And what the archaeological evidence has shown is we have a number of burials of people who are not Egyptian. These are not Egyptian burials. They are foreigners. There's no sign whatsoever that Egyptian burials, that anything we see in Egyptian burials is found there. And in some cases, these are even execration burials. In other words, there was a ritual that the Egyptians participated in where they would inscribe on a piece of pottery, for example, an enemy, and then they would smash that pottery And the smashing of the pottery demonstrates how the gods were going to enact this in life. In other words, because they smashed the pottery, the god is going to smash the enemies. Well, for the first time in known history, we have evidence of not just this ritual with a piece of pottery and an enemy's name on it, but for the first time ever, we have actual people who were killed, foreign people, with this ritual that took place. And this is an anomaly in all of Egyptological study. And the chief excavator is at a complete loss as to why this happened. Well, a number of these types of burials demonstrate that these were people who were severely wounded, and in some cases experienced the cutting off of a head or a hand or something else. So these were not normal burials. They were buried face down in many cases. They were a couple bodies sometimes thrown on top of each other and ritually killed. So this is just more evidence that lines up perfectly, historically, with the right stratum, the right level, archaeological level, demonstrating a certain period of time, and that matches perfectly with the, in this case, the birth of Moses.
Wow, that's pretty amazing stuff. So, Doug, if people want to get in contact with you or support you in some other way, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, I would say the easiest way would be to email me at dp@exegesisinternational.org. Another way would be you could look me up on the internet under, there's a website, fantastic website, and I recommend it for anyone who's involved in any kind of study, research, academic pursuit. It's called academia.edu. I have my own webpage. All you'd have to do is Google my name, Douglas Petrovich, and look for academia.edu, and you can find my profile there. You can download my articles from there, so it's the perfect site for doing that. And you could always, become a part of academia.edu, even as you can call yourself an independent researcher if you're not a student or a faculty member at an institution. And then you can write me straight through the message board on academia.edu.
All right, soon to be Dr. Douglas Petrovich, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we'll be praying for you, and thank you so much for this information. I'm sure it's going to really encourage a lot of people out there.
You're very welcome, Neil, and definitely God's blessing on all who hear this and who love to seek the truth. And as my professors taught me, time and truth go hand in hand. And another important principle that I live with is a quote by a certain Christian martyr who died during the time of the Reformation. His name was Balthasar Hubmaier, and he said, "Truth is unkillable."
Wow.
So to all who would listen, I would say, remember, you can take truth, put it in a chest, lock it up, put chains around it, and drop it into the Marianas Trench, and one day that truth is going to rise to the surface.
Excellent quote. I love that. Thank you so much, Doug. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this week on the EIE Radio broadcast. Next week, I will be talking with Jesse Boyd, founder of Foolproof Ministries, and he has got some incredible stories for us. I can't wait to get this one released out to you guys. So until next week, go out there, stand for truth, reach the lost. Take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of the EIE Radio Podcast. If you would like to make sure that this podcast stays on the air, please check out the Support Us page at EIERadio.com to find out how you can help us in our continuing mission to help Christians stand for truth and reach the lost.